On a serene late autumn afternoon at Willow Grove Park, a young homeless teen of color, quietly residing in a derelict bus stop, witnessed a 6-year-old girl slip into the pond. As the girl's father stood frozen in panic, the teen intervened, executed flawless CPR, revived the child, and then slipped away unnoticed. No one knew who he was. Unbeknownst to him, the girl's mother was a wealthy philanthropist, and when the family tracked him down, his world transformed. Before we explore this tale, share where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. It was a crisp autumn afternoon at Willow Grove Park, where half-bare trees let golden sunlight filter through their branches like the warm exhale of the season. Dry leaves crunched underfoot, dancing across paths in gentle breezes, while the pond's calm surface mirrored a sky fading into soft amber. A weathered bench, its wood worn smooth by time, stood under an ancient oak, silently overlooking the water that had witnessed decades pass. Just beyond the neatly trimmed trail, tucked behind a cluster of shrubs, was an old bus stop, its roof sagging, its panels clouded and cracked from years of neglect. Most passers-by ignored it, assuming it was empty, a forgotten piece of the town's rougher history. But within, nestled in the dimmest corner, sat a boy who had nowhere else to call home. Jaden Brooks was 17 or so, he figured. He'd lost track of time after his 15th birthday, the last one he'd marked with a cupcake at a youth shelter before it shut down. Since then, life had been measured in seasons, in scavenged meals, in sleepless nights and fleeting moments of warmth. In the quiet burden of solitude he carried without protest. His skin was deep brown, his frame lean. His clothes, mismatched layers from thrift bins, hung loosely, like chapters of a story that didn't quite align. Yet despite his worn shoes, the frayed hem of his jacket, and the backpack faded by grime and time, his gaze held something unbroken, a sharp awareness, a resilience that didn't need to shout. In his hands was a battered notebook, its pages soft and curling, filled with handwritten first aid instructions, CPR steps, and emergency tips meticulously copied from library books and old flyers. It was his treasure, a map not just for helping others, but for holding on to something of himself. He often visited the park in the late afternoons, not expecting anything, but because it was peaceful, and people rarely stared. He'd refill his water bottle at the fountain near the swings, sit on the grass where no one lingered, and study his notes in the waning light, whispering procedures like a prayer. Today was no exception. He was reviewing the 32 compression-to-breath ratio when a child's giggle snapped his focus. Turning, he saw a small girl, no older than 6, racing across the lawn, her pink sneakers flashing as she chased a bouncing ball down a gentle hill. Nearby, on a bench with a tablet balanced on his lap and a phone at his ear, sat a man, polished, composed, his leather shoes gleaming, his eyes darting between his screen and the girl with practiced calm. That was Marcus, though Jaden didn't know his name then. He seemed like someone with a packed schedule, a home full of organized shelves, and a life that didn't creak with absence. The girl, Sophie, bubbled with boundless energy, her innocence almost coaxing a smile from Jaden. Her sneakers were pristine, the kind that left faint marks on polished floors. The kind Jaden once dreamed of, but no longer dwelled on. He watched them briefly, just a flicker, long enough to feel a pang he couldn't name, then returned to his notebook, tracing the diagram of chest compressions with a fingertip. Behind him, a breeze stirred, loosening a few stubborn leaves from the branches above. Marcus stood, stepping aside to take a call in a quieter spot. His back to the pond, his voice low but brisk, the tone of someone juggling multiple tasks. "Yes, I'm watching her. She's right there. Go ahead, I'll be here another 10 minutes. Jaden didn't mean to eavesdrop, but his senses, honed by years of survival, picked up the words effortlessly. Something in Marcus's voice, caring yet distracted, echoed a memory from long ago, from a time before Jaden's world unraveled into shelter cots and signed forms. Then in an instant everything changed. It was a moment so fleeting it could have slipped by unnoticed. Jaden glanced up and Sophie was gone. The grassy slope where she'd played now seemed sharper, the quack of distant ducks oddly loud. Marcus turned, phone still in hand, his face paling as he scanned the empty field. His lips parted, first in a whisper, then in a frantic shout. He moved forward, then ran, his phone falling to the grass with a soft thud. Jaden stood, his eyes narrowing. At the pond's edge, a tiny pink shoe floated lazily, spinning in the current like a leaf adrift. Marcus's cry shattered the quiet like a stone through glass, raw and desperate, the kind of sound that halted strangers and sent birds scattering. "Sophie!" he yelled again, his voice breaking as his eyes locked on the water, rejecting what they saw. The little shoe, with its bright pink laces, drifted near the reeds, a silent marker of something unthinkable. He didn't pause. There was no time for thought, only a father's instinct and a crushing wave of fear that stole his breath. In seconds, his shoes hit the water, splashing through the shallows as he waded in, arms reaching, hands shaking, heart pounding like a drum. Jaden's notebook slipped from his hands, pages fluttering to the bench, then the ground, forgotten as his body moved faster than his thoughts. Marcus's scream ignited something in him, a silent order act from his spot behind the shrubs. He saw Marcus chest deep in the pond, thrashing through the water, calling Sophie's name with growing desperation. His cries broke, rising like sparks from a collapsing fire. Then Marcus froze, gasped, and lunged forward. When he surfaced, he held a small, limp figure, her body slick and still, like a marionette with cut strings. The sight nearly buckled Jaden's knees. Sophie was motionless, her arms dangling, head lolled back, eyes shut, lips a pale grey that didn't belong on a child. Marcus staggered to the shore, collapsing onto the grass, laying her flat, his sobs deep and ragged, tearing from his chest with every breath. His hands fumbled, uncertain, trying to recall a half-forgotten first aid class. He dialed 911, shouted into the phone, then dropped it, pressing on her chest with shaky palms, his rhythm uneven, his breaths too frantic to deliver air. He was drowning too, in terror. Jaden had never run so fast. He crossed the lawn in long strides, ignoring the thud of his pulse and the tremble in his legs. As he reached them, he slowed, not from doubt, but to gather the fragments of his training scattered by adrenaline. Marcus looked up, startled, his eyes flashing with confusion, fear, and a flicker of hope, the last thread of trust when all else frays. "I know what to do," Jaden said, breathless but steady, his voice firm with urgency, not fear. "Please let me help." For a moment Marcus hesitated. Jaden was a stranger, a boy in tattered clothes, uninvited, unverified. But something in his gaze, calm, resolute, almost beyond his years, made Marcus's hands fall away, his body shifting aside. Jaden knelt beside Sophie and began. He gently tilted her head to clear her airway, his movements precise, almost reverent. He leaned close, checked for breath, watched her chest, felt only cold stillness. Pinching her nose, he sealed his mouth over hers and gave 2 careful breaths, watching her chest rise and fall. Then he placed his hands on her sternum, found the right spot, locked his elbows, and started compressions. 1, 2, 3, he counted silently, not for show, but to anchor the rhythm etched in his memory. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, again, then again. Time blurred, stretched, vanished. Marcus crouched nearby, paralyzed by awe and dread, hands clasped tightly. His daughter lay so still, impossibly still. Yet Jaden pressed on, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill, arms burning, shoulders aching. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He knew this moment, had rehearsed it countless times under dim streetlights. But now it was real, a life, a child, not just notes. Then on the 5th cycle, as he pulled back from a breath, Sophie twitched, then shuddered. A wet, choking cough burst from her lips, followed by a gasp that made Marcus cry out. Water dribbled from her mouth as her chest heaved, her eyes flickering open, dazed but alive. Marcus lunged forward, sobbing, pulling Sophie into his arms, kissing her damp hair, whispering her name through tears. Jaden exhaled, not in triumph, but in quiet release, his body unclenching, hands trembling, legs numb, heart still racing as if unsure the danger had passed. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, tires crunching on the park's gravel paths. Jaden stood slowly, uncertain of his place in this new moment, unsure if he belonged now that the crisis had ebbed. Marcus looked up, searching for the boy who had saved his daughter. But Jaden, without waiting for thanks or questions, turned away. He retrieved his notebook from the grass, brushed off a stray leaf, and walked back toward the shrubs, vanishing into the shadows as red and blue lights flooded the park. He didn't glance back. He didn't need to. He'd given everything he had, and for someone like him, that was enough. By the time paramedics reached the pond, Marcus sat on the grass cradling Sophie, her small chest rising against his, her hair still wet and plastered to his jacket where his tears had fallen. He barely looked up, too overwhelmed by the miracle, too shaken by the fragility of those minutes when he'd nearly lost everything. The medics worked swiftly, their voices steady, checking Sophie's vitals, asking Marcus questions that jumbled in his mind. He could only gesture toward the shrubs where the boy had stood. "He saved her," he murmured. But when they looked, the bushes swayed in the breeze, empty. Jaden was gone, crossing the park's back lot, slipping into the town's quiet streets, his notebook pressed to his chest like a shield. He moved quickly, not fleeing, not hiding, but fading away as only those accustomed to being unseen can. The world often overlooked boys like him, worn, silent, unmoored. Even after something extraordinary, he knew better than to linger for recognition. At the hospital, Sophie was declared stable, her cheeks regaining color, her breathing steady, though weak from exhaustion. Marcus stayed by her side, holding her hand softly, smoothing damp curls from her face, his coffee untouched on the bedside table. He replayed the moment endlessly, the splash, the silence, the shoe, the panic, and then that boy, appearing like a quiet miracle, his hands steady, his voice grounding. Marcus hadn't asked his name. The realization hit him with a pang of guilt. In his fear, he'd entrusted his daughter's life to a stranger, but hadn't thought to ask who he was, where he'd come from, or how he'd known what to do. Clara, Sophie's mother, arrived that night, rushing from a conference in Seattle, her coat askew, her face tight with worry that softened when she saw Sophie sleeping under a warm blanket. Marcus met her at the door, and they held each other tightly. "She's okay," he said into her hair. "She almost wasn't, but she is." They sat in silence, the kind that follows a tempest when words feel too small. Then Marcus shared the story, not just the near drowning, not just the CPR, but the boy. "He came out of nowhere, Clara. He knew exactly what to do. He saved her and left. Didn't ask for anything. Just walked away." Clara, a woman who built solutions from chaos, who believed in action over sentiment, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, not in skepticism but resolve. "You said he was young." Marcus nodded. "Maybe 16, 17, worn clothes, thin. I think he might be on his own." Clara stood pacing the room. "We have to find him. Not just to thank him, but to do something for him. Someone who can stay that composed, act with that clarity. He deserves more than a life on the streets." And so the search began. The next day, a reward was announced, not for a criminal but for a savior. Posters appeared around town, describing only unknown teenage boy, approximately 16, 17, seen leaving Willow Grove Park after saving a child. Security footage from park cameras was reviewed. Local news ran stories titled "The Vanishing Rescuer," urging anyone with information to come forward. The town hummed with intrigue, moved by the humility of the act. In a world often numbed by grim headlines, this story sparked something rare, belief that goodness could still exist, quiet and uncelebrated. Yet Jaden remained elusive. He avoided crowds, changed his routes, slept in different corners of town, depending on which spots felt safest. He'd overheard talk of the search, glimpsed a news report on a shop window TV, but didn't connect it to himself. He didn't seek praise. What he cherished silently was the moment in the park when he'd felt purpose, a fleeting sense of belonging. He guarded it like a fragile ember, wary of attention, snuffing it out. But destiny has its own rhythm. It wasn't a broadcast or flyer that revealed him, but a street cleaner, Ms. Lorraine, who'd swept the same routes for decades and noticed every face that passed. One evening, over tea at a corner diner, she mentioned to the cook, "I know that boy they're looking for. He sorts through the bins by the park, always neat about it. Quiet kid, polite. Sleeps in that old bus stop by Willow Grove. I've seen him reading some kind of medical notes. He's a good one. That small observation, shared in passing, would guide Clara back to the boy who saved her daughter, not through technology or detectives, but through the quiet attention of an ordinary woman. And under the same oak tree where Sophie once chased her ball, where leaves now blanketed the ground in gold, a story that began in silence would restart with a name. At dawn, Clara returned to Willow Grove Park, wrapped in a thick scarf that held faint traces of forgotten winters. She carried a cloth bag with fresh muffins and a flask of hot cocoa, her other hand holding Sophie's, who skipped beside her, her energy renewed, oblivious to the worry etched in her mother's eyes. The trees stood still, branches glistening with morning dew, the pond reflecting a soft pink sunrise. Clara said little as they followed the path past the bench, past the spot where the shoe had drifted, until they saw the bus stop. It seemed smaller now, almost too frail to have cradled such courage. At first, there was no sign of life. Just a worn backpack by a post and a tattered blanket folded around a still form. Sophie broke free, running forward with unbridled joy. "It's him, Mommy. It's him!" she called, her voice ringing across the quiet field. Clara approached slowly, her throat tightening as she saw the boy, barely older than a child, stirring in the corner. Blinking against the dawn, Jaden sat up, instinctively reaching for his pack, ready to vanish into the margins where he'd lived unseen. But then he saw Sophie, her eyes bright with wonder, her hands outstretched as if greeting a legend in plain clothes. "You saved me," she said simply, with the unfiltered truth of a child who'd faced life and death in one breath. Jaden froze, unsure how to respond to such open gratitude, bracing for doubt but finding none. Clara knelt beside Sophie, looking at Jaden with a quiet strength that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken rehearsals of this moment. "We didn't get to thank you," she said softly. "I've searched for you every day. We wouldn't have Sophie without you. I wouldn't have my daughter." Her voice wavered, the bag crinkling as her grip tightened. "You didn't just save her. You gave us back time we thought was gone. I owe you more than I can ever give." Jaden shook his head slightly, his voice rough with sleep and shyness. "You don't owe me. I was just there. It's what I knew." Clara studied him, her eyes not with pity, but with something deeper, admiration. She held out the bag. "It's warm. I wasn't sure what you'd like, so I brought a bit of everything." Jaden hesitated, then accepted it gently, as if it might dissolve in his hands. "Thank you," he murmured. They sat there, the three of them, under the soft dawn sky, with no fanfare, no crowd, just the ripple of water and the chirp of early birds. Sophie broke the quiet, climbing onto the bench beside Jaden, her legs swinging. "I want to learn what you did. I want to help people too." Jaden looked at her, struck by the sincerity of her wish, by the thought that his act might inspire something beyond that moment. Clara smiled at her daughter, then turned to Jaden. "If you want to go to school, I can help. Not as charity, but because it feels right. My foundation has a program, housing, mentors, education. I can make it happen. No strings, just your choice." Jaden opened his mouth, then closed it, not from refusal, but because he'd spent so long being invisible that this offer felt like stepping into blinding light. He glanced at Sophie, who beamed at him, unaware of the weight in his silence. "Do I have to wear a tie?" he asked, half smiling. Clara laughed, a warm, unguarded sound. "Only if you feel like it." She pulled a card from her pocket and handed it to him gently. "When you're ready, we'll be here." For the first time in years, Jaden didn't feel the urge to flee. He looked at the card, then at Sophie, then at Clara, who hadn't come to pity him, but to offer something rarer, trust. And for the first time, he let himself trust too, not in grand promises, but in the quiet possibility that he might not have to walk alone anymore. Maybe the world still had room for a boy who'd learned CPR by flashlight. Maybe this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Nearly a year had passed since that chilly morning in Willow Grove Park, since a shoeless boy, in a faded jacket, knelt beside a lifeless child and gave all he had without asking for anything. The seasons had shifted softly, as they do when life moves forward. not with fanfare, but with steady steps. The bus stop where Jaden once slept was now a small community plot, funded by a local grant, though a bench remained nearby, where sometimes a lone daisy appeared, as if planted by the wind, tilting toward the pond in quiet memory. Inside the bright walls of the town's learning center, where posters of first aid steps lined the halls, and the air smelled of paper and coffee, Jaden stood at the front of a classroom, not as a student but as a teacher. He wore a simple navy jacket, new but unpretentious, and a name tag pinned to his chest, a small token of belonging he never took for granted. Before him sat parents and teens, some skeptical about giving up their Saturday for CPR training, but now attentive, drawn in by the quiet confidence of the young man who spoke with warmth and a wisdom born of experience, not textbooks. He demonstrated on a dummy, his hands steady, his voice clear. "Place your hands here," he said, pressing the sternum. "Not too high, not too low. Push hard, push fast. If you're afraid, that's fine. Do it afraid, but do it because someone's life might depend on you." The room was still focused. Even the kids fidgeted less, sensing this was more than a lesson. It was a legacy. In the back, Sophie sat, her hands clasped proudly, a handmade badge on her shirt reading Future Rescuer. She attended every class, not for the certificate, but because Jaden was more than a friend. He was proof of what it meant to act without hesitation. Lara sat beside her, watching Jaden lead with a presence that needed no spotlight. And she thought, as she had so often, how close this story came to tragedy. Yet here they were, alive, connected, building something gentle and good from what could have been loss. Sophie tugged Jaden's sleeve after class, her voice earnest. "One day I'll be like you." Jaden knelt to her level, a hand on her shoulder, his smile finally reaching his eyes. "No," he said softly. "One day you'll be better." And perhaps that was the heart of it. Not that he'd saved a life, not that he'd rebuilt his own, but that he'd done it without seeking praise. He'd seen a need and acted, not for glory, but from a quiet faith in himself, in the power of a single choice to ripple outward, reshaping the world in small, tender ways. He never called himself a hero, never claimed the word. But for one family, one girl, and now a room of future lifesavers, Jaden would always be the one who stepped up when it was easier to stay hidden, who chose to help without pause. And that was enough. That was everything. Join us to share inspiring stories by clicking like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to begin your day with lessons of courage and compassion.